how many of you here dealing with someone that you know with depression and possible suicide? Okay, there's quite a lot of us here. I want to tell you something, and we're going to deal with the difficult part first, and we're going to dispel some myths. And then we're going to be talking about some helpful for people who have depression that are prone to suicide and how to handle that. And in fact, after this workshop, hopefully things become a lot easier and clearer at the end. And feel free to raise your hand if you have questions during the workshop, because I like to make this interactive instead of just throwing a PowerPoint at you. First of all, and I'd like to just introduce myself real quick. My name is Phillip Lowe. I'm a clinical psychologist at Kaiser Walnut Creek up north. And sometime my patient will be introducing me. Hey, you're going to be meeting Dr. Phil today. The patient will go, really, Dr. Phil? But they will follow by, but he's got more hair, and then he's also Asian. And then all of a sudden, they said, okay, I got the picture. So with other jokes aside, sometimes I would ask people, when you feel depressed, how low can you get, right? They said, oh, go to Phil Lowe. And and sometimes I tell them that you come to see me, I guarantee you things usually get better on its own. And not on its own, but after seeing me, it's like the Lowe's improvement workshop, So having that aside, I want to just check with you, how many of you actually have heard of people saying, for example, I'm a little depressed. Does it really make you clinically diagnosed as having major depression? The answer is usually no, right? A lot of you actually are pretty savvy. In order for you to be diagnosed as having depression, you have to have at least 5 of the following symptoms and persist over 2 weeks. So let me just dispel that. Every one of us get a little depressed in our lifetime, don't you? How many people here have felt a little depressed, let's say, throughout this week? I just felt a little depressed. Now be brave now. Okay, great. These are the courageous soul. Thank you. God bless you. I felt a little depressed too because I was on my way over here to flying to Southern California, right? Guess what? My Lyft driver have canceled 3 times. I was on my way. I only have an hour gap catching my BART over to Oakland Airport, and the Lyft driver canceled me 3 times. Can you believe that? At the end, guess what happened? My neighbor shows up. He said, what are you doing? It looks like you're in a hurry and trying to fly somewhere. I said, yeah, I'm trying to come to the seminar. And then I was feeling a little down and depressed, right? But that's not clinical depression. In order for someone to be clinical depressed, you have to have feeling down and depressed, sad and teary that you cannot control, feeling fatigue, sleep disturbances, and appetite change, meaning that either you don't eat at all or you eat a whole lot. Like, you used to eat just one piece of pizza meal, you end up eating the whole pie of pizza, for example, and hide some of that underneath your carpet. And losing concentration and having focus issue, feeling guilty about what you're going through, and then also isolation and withdrawn. Exactly the opposite of what we want to do. So let me just dispel the myth of what clinical depression looks like. Now, I want to go back to the previous slide real quick. Oops, this is refusing to cooperate. Let me see. Okay, now depression, it is the most common mental health illness of all type. Now, however, I noticed that there are probably about a third women here, about 2/3 women here, and guess what? However, depression hits women more than men, by 2-to-1 ratio at least. Now, for whatever reason that is, we suspected a lot of reason why that is the case, but it just tells me that women are more vulnerable to depression because partly, postpartum depression, the part that you're more emotionally in tune than men. Men are more task-oriented, men are more action-based and things like that. It protects men a little bit more than women, okay? So, and also, among older adults, depression, paranoid dementia are the most common. So I wanted to speak to that a little bit. And now, I'm going to go really fast because they only give us 15 minutes, and plus that we're late from the break. And then some of you visit the bathroom, no fault at own. It's the right thing to do. If you don't go, you'll feel a little depressed too. So if I glance over some topic a little bit too fast, feel free to raise your hand and pause me and say, oh no, I need a little elaboration on that. Please do. And let's see. Okay, we already talked about a lot of the symptoms of depression. Now, something that caused depression to be one of the most hazardous mental illness out there, because severe depression can lead to suicide and suicidal thoughts. Now, this is a perfect opportunity for me to elaborate some more. I'm not going to read from these slides because you have it in your handout. And also apology up front too, is that your handout is going to look a little different than my presentation here because I keep adding contents along the way as on my flight here. And when I'm waiting for my lift cancellation, I add a couple of more slides. Okay.
What's the first word?
Anhedonia. How many people know the word hedonia? It's a Greek word. It means that you engage in like happiness, joyful activity. And is the opposite of that, having no joy. Okay, thank you for asking. No, I want to just talk about a little bit on the last couple of things that on the slide here. Oops. Sorry, just bear with me for a second. I'm still trying to navigate this computer. Okay. I want to just talk a little bit more about people who are depressed. They tend to be more irritable. For women, they tend to have uncontrollable outbursts of crying, teariness. For men, it's kind of different. Men in depression, they tend to have more angry outbursts. And they tend to have very little threshold for irritability. For example, if you talk to someone who is depressed, is that, why aren't you getting better? You've been, sad and crying for the last 2 weeks. For a moment, my goodness, that would open up the floodgate. They would be crying uncontrollably. For men, they would actually stood up and look at you in the face with, big, eyeballs and then say, why are you saying to me, haven't you said enough? Have you bothered me enough? So having lower threshold of tolerance for irritability tend to be the hallmark feature of all depression. So that brings up to that verse in Job where Job was being visited by 3 friends, right? And you remember in the beginning, these 3 friends, what did they do? The first encounter, they stayed pretty much silent, right? And guess what? How did Job respond to that silence? Anybody remember? It's okay. I'm not trying to put in guilt and shame. You don't remember what happened. Job actually was really good. He's doing good. He was really happy with that presence of their friends. But guess what? When the friends start irritating him, then, well, have you thought about what you have done lately? Or have you thought about what you have done in the past, maybe 3 weeks or 3 years? And guess what? Job started getting angry. And that's what we meant by, having little threshold for irritability. And tendency for self-isolation is also another hallmark feature of depression. So someone who's depressed and tend to shut the blinder in the house and stay in the dark room all day, that tend to be depression too. A good friend of mine, very capable engineer, worked at a water district. When he was in severe depression, the only thing that he can do is that he goes to work, not shave, come home, shut himself in a dark room and just sat in a chair for all night. And his wife didn't even bother to knock on the door. She would just leave the dinner tray right by the shut door and then just to tell him, hey, dinner's ready, and left him there on his own. And that's what depression looks like. Does that sound familiar to some of you? How many people here have seen people depressed and shut themselves out from the rest of the world? Yes, yeah. You have a question?
You asked a question?
Yeah, did you have a question?
No.
Okay, you mean you have encountered people like that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. What was your feeling when people shut themselves out?
Helplessness.
Helplessness, yes, very prevalent. What else?
Just kind of rejection.
Rejection, exactly. People who are depressed sometimes tend to have what we call toxin effect. What toxin effect means that when they're depressed, it makes you feel either angry, rejected, abandoned, or whatnot. So depression doesn't affect just the individual themselves, it affects the community as a whole. Does that make sense, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes?
So I know you said depression, people tend to be more irritable. Is that opposite if someone's personality is more irritable, have low threshold, they have more tendency to get depression?
Right. What we tend to see is that's a good question. We tend to see a more polarized response. Polarized response means either someone completely shut themselves out, they don't become irritable, they shut themselves out, totally withdrawn, that they're giving you a signal. What is that signal giving you if they're completely withdrawn? They don't want to be bothered. Right? Now, the opposite response is that they get into this angry outburst. They would be shouting and giving you the F word, saying, on your mother's grave that you're the worst person they ever met, right? So even though you're the best friend. So we tend to see a more polarized response, opposite end. That makes sense?
Yes.
Does that answer your question?
Actually, my question is, people born with different characteristics, right? Some people
Sure.
have highest threshold to become angry, some
Sure.
people have lowest threshold.
Sure.
So I'm saying, does those people who naturally born with lowest threshold, they have more tendency to become depression?
Okay. We see that too. Personality trait makes a difference in terms of how vulnerable a person, to depression. Yes, very much so. In fact, we'll speak to that a little bit more later on, and what leads people to, becoming depressed. Okay, so let's fast forward. Okay, my mouse doesn't work. Why is that? Let's try again. Okay. All right. So why would people become depressed? Why is someone more resilient toward depression and some aren't? These are the several reasons. For example, family issue and circumstantial issue. For example, you are constantly dealing with emotionally demanding parent or spouse, constant conflict in your family, and family might be drawn to like financial distress and whatnot. That's on the family kind of social side. And genetically, people who grew up from depressed family or family who tend to be less resilient, more vulnerable to depression. And other risk factor, for example, for elderly folks, who are aging, who have aging parents or aging partner or whatnot, then they tend to experience more losses in life. And experiencing, rejection, for example, talking about recently dating experience at church, right? If you're constantly being rejected by, trying to court someone, and then you can get depressed too. And similar to other mental illnesses, that depression is likely not due to one factor alone. It's due to many factors combined. Is that fair? Okay. All right. I hope that also answers some of the question about genetic and personality. Yes?
It's more likely like older people?
Okay. Are older people more susceptible to depression? I would say yes. Simply because of what? Can anybody name some risk factor for older folks? Health issues, right? How many of you know of elderly people who have diabetes? How many people know of people with dementia? So chronic illness and also later life illnesses also contribute to depression. And guess what? If you're a caretaker for elderly patients, you tend to be more vulnerable as well. Okay.
There's no stress as a factor.
Stress is not a factor. In fact, all these are stress. Working stress too. Yes. When I talk about family issue, I should include environmental issues. Yes. Stress at work. If you constantly faced with a demeaning boss that give you a criticism, no matter what you do, you put in 80 hours a week, you still get a C remark. That's going to make you pretty depressed, right?
Well, we are seeing so many young people.
Good. I would encourage you to attend the second workshop that I give. That talks about common mental disorders, and it talks about teenagers as well. Okay. So I'm sorry, I've got to hold off some information here just because there's a lot in this workshop I need to get through. Okay. Any other questions or clarification, Carr? Okay. Now, why would women be more susceptible to depression? Partly because genetically you need to bear children. Most of women give birth, right? And about 50 to 80% of women who've been giving birth before experience some kind of mild form of postpartum blues. And more than 50% of women relapse if you have postpartum depression before. So that's another risk factor that kind of protects men, unfortunately, that we don't need to give birth. So men, you should consider yourself pretty fortunate. Okay. Now, something we need to talk about is that depression, we cannot put one single label on the depression. Depression falls into what they call a spectrum of mild, moderate to severe. Okay, mild depression would be someone, for example, being rejected by someone, being abandoned by someone, and they felt depressed, but they still can go to work. They can still wake up in the morning, but they just feel a little bit more struggle. It's like you're kind of like doing a tug of war. Moderate depression start to affect a person's daily functioning. For example, getting up to work, being able to perform at your 100%, being able to relate to other people, things like that. That's called moderate depression. Now, severe depression will cause someone to stay in bed almost 24/7, and they would have suicidal thought, don't want to live anymore. In fact, severe ones would start developing plan how they can end their life. And that's the reason we talk about 90% of people who commit suicide all have mental illness in some form, right? And let's talk about that some more. Is that clear with the spectrum of depression? Now, another class of depression we call dysthymic disorder. This is a kind of different flavor of depression. What it means is that someone grew up throughout their lifetime, they always feel a little melancholic. It's like no matter how bright the sunshine outside, you always feel a little grayness to it. And they said there's a silver lining to every cloud. This is actually the opposite. There's always a cloud in every silver lining, that kind of thing. And always feeling like you can't kick yourself into the high gear. Dysthymic disorder. It's something that people feel like throughout their lifetime, some kind of sleep disturbance, low self-esteem, difficulty concentration, and it's not performing at your 100%, throughout your life. Okay, this is what they call a persistent kind of depression, dysthymic. And how many people have heard of this term before, dysthymic disorder? Not really. Some of you have, right? And how did you come across this term? Just curiosity.
I took undergrad at Michigan State for psychology, so this is a little bit applicable in my field of study. So
okay.
It seems very closely associated to self-helplessness.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and that's something I came to learn, not just within school, but also just on campus too, with high stress and high anxiety. So it kind of arises out of that. So that's how I came to it.
Got it. Okay, thanks for sharing with that. And I'm glad that some of us have some exposure to this kind of disorder. Yes.
I'm sorry. When I hear this word, what is it comparison to bipolar?
How's that compared to bipolar? Now, the term dysthymic or clinical depression is what we call unipolar disorder, meaning that we only lean toward the low side of mood. Now, bipolar is something that swings between the opposite side frequently, like from being severely depressed to severely manic, severely agitated, and have bounty energy, working in the mode of a Superman or Superwoman. So that's what we call bipolar. And sometimes we kid that a little bit in teenagers, that every teenager's had mini bipolar episodes. And I'm sure parents with young children experience that, right? Okay. Yes?
So can you explain unipolar? Because does this just mean that this person has this disorder and they're always down?
Okay. So you're talking about dysthymic?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Unipolar describe dysthymic, meaning that if you look at from being sad to being supremely happy, right? These people tend to be stuck in the lower end of the scale, kind of on a down mood all the time. No matter what you say, even including if you won the $1.6 billion lottery, right? They said, no, you can lose them all, yeah, that kind of thing. Things always have this dark flavor to it.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope that's kind of plain language you can understand. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, remember the slide we looked at before? What makes a person depressed, right? It's likely not one reason alone. it had some genetic factor, environmental factor, it had upbringing factor, it has like circumstantial reason. For example, I've seen kids who are dysthymic when they were little because they lost their parent really young, lost both parents really young. You know, if that doesn't make them dysthymic, that would be really hard, right? But I also have seen individuals who have dysthymic, they broke out of it because of their faith. They believe that there's a hope out there, and they pull themselves out. For example, one of the most famous celebrity out there, Nick Vujicic, you know of him, right? And he had this seminar called Limb Without Limit, right? And he was born without limbs, and he was mocked at and being called monster ever since he grew up. For him, dysthymic is a very fitting disorder, but he pulled himself out of that, since many times he tried to drown himself in bathtubs. But fortunately, with enough encouragement and hope and faith, and he recovered. Now he's, doing a lot of good work. So,
Yeah.
oh, yes. Oh, great. Well, maybe I can go get an autograph while I'm here. Okay. Any other clarification required? Thank you for asking these questions. These are great questions. So these are just some numbers. We talk about what the onset and as well as the prevalence. I just want to point out that usually boys and girls, they have the same equal ratio having depression. It's only when puberty starts to take place where men and women start to differ. Okay. Now, something I wanted to speak to, hopefully that will also destigmatize depression. Depression in itself is very much a medical illness, actually. Sometimes we said that mental illness in many ways is psychological, but that's really not the case. Most people who are depressed, we find that they tend to be low in a couple of neurotransmitters that are in our brain called serotonin and norepinephrine. These two chemicals, when they are low, it will cause everyone to be depressed, regardless of Donald Trump or Pope Francis, if they have these low chemicals. And what makes them low is actually the reason we talked about before, partly genetic, partly because of circumstantial, environmental, episodic, like being abandoned or having a broken marriage and things like that. Is that making sense? And it will cause these chemicals to be low. And in order for you to be not feeling depressed, these chemicals need to be boosted up. They can be boosted up artificially through antidepressant, or they can boost up through behavioral therapy. And that's why people wonder, why would talk therapy help? Actually, talk therapy is one of the best ways holistically to cure depression, which I can talk more about that. But the most important thing we need to get to is the suicide part. I just want to talk about a quick story about in 2000, I believe in 2004, Lysandra Armstrong, a African-American lady, after she had a conflict with her husband, what she did was that she decided in a spur of the moment, drove her minivan, she buckled up all her 5 kids into the van. She drove that van right into the Hudson River. And later on, one of the kids actually opened up the power window. He's 10-year-old LaShawn. He opened up the power window, managed to make himself up to the surface, and he reported that to the police. Police sent a diving team to the bottom of the river, found the other 4 kids and mom all dying in front of the wheel, and also the youngest baby, I think it's a 5-month-old baby that was strapped to the car seat. So sometimes tragedy is not avoidable, and sometimes tragedy can be completely unexpected and unfathomable in its own way. And I want to talk a little bit real quick, take a moment or so. I remember when I was in college, one night I received a phone call, and my sister called me and said, something happened. And I said, what? And turns out that my brother committed suicide. And he was sent to intensive care unit the night, and he actually never made it through the night. He died in the hospital through committing suicide. And some people ask me what I do for a living. I used to be a pastor, and also now I'm a clinical psychologist. And said, in order for you to be a psychologist, you must come from a dysfunctional family, huh? Well, I kind of laugh. I said, yeah, you're so insightful. You're right, And I have a brother who committed suicide, and I have, 50% divorce rate in our family, and that's along with other health-related issues. And I said, but you know what? I'm not ashamed of speaking about these tragedy and the brokenness in my life, because by talking about it, confessing to a community that are trustworthy, it actually breaks the stronghold of mental illness and brokenness. And the reason I'm standing here, because I wrestled with these brokenness for years, but after I wrestled with them, sat with attention, and then also confess that with trusted community, I become cured, and I'm here speaking to you from someone who struggled with mental illness. So I'm glad that you're here, and I am so glad that we can talk about some of these tragedy, because it will start to break hold of the stronghold of the mental illness part. And let me not speak too much about myself. I'm sure we have a chance to do that throughout the day, but let me go into some more. And so, with depression, what are helpful is the following. Research have shown that both medication and cognitive behavioral therapy, they are very effective. In fact, for mild to moderate depression, we at Kaiser, we usually don't recommend antidepressants to start out with cognitive behavioral therapy, or just behavioral therapy on its own with counseling and whatnot. And I have seen many of my patients, I would say 99% of my patients who have been walked through my door all got better. The only 1% that did not get better are the ones that never returned. Fair enough? So in other words, therapy and antidepressant will help. Something I want to expose you to, hopefully that would demystify. Some of you have heard of this term called ECT, right? Electroconvulsive therapy. Convulsive therapy, it's a form of electrical shock treatment to the brain that has seemed to help people who have depression that are otherwise not curable through CBT or through other medication. But one of the major side effects is that people tend to lose memory through ECT. That's why ECT tend not to be prescribed so much these days. It usually looked at as upon one of the last resort. Okay? And another term called TMS, I don't know if I put it here, or somehow it doesn't show up. So another treatment modality called TMS, transcranial, forgot what's the other term, therapy. It's a form of, another form of brain stimulation that can cause people to be cured from depression that are otherwise not curable. So I want to just expose you real quick to ECT and TMS. If you have run into a family member that has tried all kinds of treatment that are not responsive, ECT and TMS could possibly be two other alternatives. Recently, there has been another class of antidepressant called ketamine. Ketamine is still in clinical trial right now. It tends to cure some of the very rare kind of depression that are not responsive to other type of treatment. So between ECT, TMS, and ketamine, those are new things that would shed light onto boosting up serotonin and norepinephrine in order for us to feel better. Okay, so there's a lot of development and breakthrough, in the last decade or so that brings a lot of hope to folks. Okay, so let me talk about suicide now. So every 12 minutes, as you sit here, about 1/4 of the time you spend here, someone already have committed suicide in the United States. It's the 10th leading cause of death, and the suicide rate is about 28% and increasing. from between 2000 to 2015, I think there's a lady asked about why some teenagers committing suicide. Just this past year, 3 students from a very prestigious school district called the Palo Alto School District up in Northern California was considered the highest achieving school. 3 students walked themselves into the Amtrak train track and killed themselves. Now, stress is one of the reasons leading to depression and suicide. And we need to really pay attention to the amount of stress we adults endure, and as well as the amount of stress our kids endure. And sometimes when parents come to me and ask me about, my kids, in a way, holistically, as Asian as myself, sometimes our culture seems to bound ourselves to high academic achievement and meeting some of the cultural model goal, right? And I often encourage parents to look at the kids holistically. We're made up both physical, biological, spiritual being. We need to balance all those factors. And at times, sometimes maybe when they're depressed, take them to a trip outside the country, look at the other part of the world, and send them to Kenya for short-term mission and things like that. Tend to do a lot of good to themselves other than pushing them through more summer camp, academic, boot camp or whatnot. Looking at the suicide rate here, the ones that are more susceptible are American Indians and non-Hispanic white groups. Now, you would ask why these groups, right? There are a lot of reasons, again. Depression and suicide are usually not contributed by one factor alone. They tend to be multiple factors combined and leading to someone to commit suicide. But one thing we do know about American Indian is that they used to have a very strong spiritual heritage, but since they were taken over by the American colonization, their heritage and spiritual root has been uprooted, and they have lost their identity in some way. And if you go to Indian community throughout the country, right, alcoholism tend to be very prevalent. And the only way they know how to cope beyond the spiritual method is resort to something easy, chemical, substance abuse. In fact, part of the reason why teenagers, our youth, and our college-age kids tend to be more depressed and also more mental illness, as substance abuse is very prevalent. You ask, just about every 1 out of 2 students on campus will be either drinking excessively or having some kind of bodily dysmorphic issues, OCD issues, and pot and cocaine and hard liquor. They're all, all over the campus. Regardless if this is MIT, Harvard, they're pretty much the same throughout. So brace yourself for that storm. Okay, so now, I often get asked the question, how do I know someone is leaning toward suicide? I often say that the hallmark indicator is that if someone comes to you and said, a kid that never cleaned up his room or his closet, will come to you and say, I'm start packing our stuff, I'm giving away these things. I have a cat, dad or mom, can you take care of my cat while I'm away? That's a sign. When you see people start cleaning out, giving away valuable possession, that's a sign beyond depression. Recently, I have a patient that came to me, talked to me in a shocking way that her daughter just committed suicide. And they didn't know until they were called from the ER. And he remembered one night his daughter was telling her, I need you to take care of my cat while I'm away. Dad didn't pick up that as a signal. And turns out that she just had a broken relationship, and she was rejected by multiple school applications, and then she's ready, she had a plan. And then she was fortunate enough to be rescued by the ER. She overdosed herself on medication. So when these things happen, something is going on. And what do you do? What do you do? Can I just pose the audience real quick? Have you run into people that kind of talk to you this way? Yeah? And can you tell me more?
We have people that come in all the time that are just having a hard time with life. And And so, in the people that we train and work with, if they're talking about suicide, we ask them if they have a plan. We try to tell them we'd be available. If they do have a plan, we make the phone call that we need to make to get them help.
Gotcha. I'm sorry, you're
Steve.
from... Oh, Steve. Okay, Pastor Steve. I think we met before. Okay. So factors contributing to suicide include the following: substance abuse, relational issue, crisis, physical health issue, including elderly adults, legal criminal cases, loss of housing, homelessness, job and finance issue. Now, let me not dwell into the number, but let me just look at this kind of take yourself in a 10,000 feet angle looking at this. There's something in common among these factors. What is that something in common? The something in common is kind of depicted in this picture when someone loses hope, thinking that tomorrow will not be a solution. When hope is lost, cutting that loss is leading to committing suicide. So our job as a faith community, we have a vital role in terms of bringing hope to people, but not just by saying people that, Jesus has resurrected and he conquered death and therefore you should be cured, right? But rather than that, hope meaning that I'm present here emotionally with you. I'm going to walk this path with you. When they see hope, when you're standing next to them, not saying anything, but just saying, hey, let's take a walk in the park. Let's go down the street and see if there's something you remotely like to eat. I'm going to get that for you. Just sit with the person. I think sitting with the tension of silence and depression is really hard for most of us, especially with people who have suicidal thoughts, right? But if you can wrestle with that tension first, be comfortable with that and not saying anything, and just do something in real action, like buying them some food, staying overnight with that person, not saying a whole lot, and restoring hope tend to be the greatest intervention for people.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Looking at these suicide factors, is there a higher rate of suicide among homelessness people?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
They encounter a lot more of these than the average person.
Right. Actually, homelessness doesn't always lead to depression. In fact, I dealt with homeless people quite a lot in the past. Some people would love to be homeless. And it was very revealing to me. Can I ask you this, okay? Thinking about a homeless person, okay? We know there's a lot of downside to homelessness. What are some of the downside to homelessness?
No security.
No security.
Cold and wet.
Cold and wet, not comfortable, right? And no creature comfort. What are other downside? Possibly being robbed on the street, right? You can't secure your property, and police can come and wipe out your whole belonging, just the street cleaning. What are the other downsides? There's a lot, right? But there's some upsides about homelessness too. Can you think of any upside about homelessness? I'm sorry?
No worry.
No worry. Why no worry?
They have nothing to lose.
No accountability.
Okay, good point. Do you have to pay rent being a homeless person? Okay, so if you get Social Security, right, all your Social Security doesn't go to your landlord. It goes to your pocket. You can buy and eat anything you want. In fact, this is what the homeless person told me. He said, there's a lot of good sides about being homeless. I said, wow, I was enlightened. In fact, when I heard that, I sat with the person. We had a lot of fun. And this person obviously is not prone to suicide. Yes.
But what's interesting is all those things up on that screen, the people that we work with and love that are all around us, we all deal with all those things.
Isn't that true?
All of it.
Isn't that true? So I would say that these suffering and downside, they're among us, all of us. Every one of us would encounter that some form or the other, yes.
I know you don't have it on here, but how much does seasonal affective disorder contribute to
Suicide? Okay. We don't have exactly those numbers, but SAD, what they call it, seasonal affective disorder, meaning that when winter time comes, you have less sunlight. Less sunlight tend to lead to depression. And there's some percentage leading to that. I don't have the exact number. There's some, but not that significant. The reason is that seasonal affective disorder tend not to be in the severe range. They tend to be staying in kind of moderate range. The people who've been through SAD that they can report, they tend to have more insight, and they start implementing intervention. For example, I have an elderly woman. During wintertime, she do not close her blind. She always bring artificial sunlight, waste, and she would actually have timer that turns on light throughout her house. So like the Nordic countries and Baltic region, they tend to have a lot of sunlight, right? They actually have people go through sunlight therapy on a periodic basis during wintertime. So they have interventions. So, okay, all right. These are again some statistics. People who do not have any known mental health issue can also, suicide. But people who have mental health illness tend to suicide by that percentage. And something enlightening here, noticing that with no mental health illness, males tend to succeed in suicide more than women, even though women have more depression than men. Why is that? Do you have any clue?
I lost 2 people to suicide, both in the high-risk categories. One young college student who was white, and another man white.
Okay.
And men succeed more because they use more lethal means.
Absolutely.
Final.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, like males ultimately they think in a way of ultimatums. So either this or that. So kind of are more rash almost too as well. So it's
Yeah.
instincts.
Everything that both of you said are correct. Men tend to use more lethal means. Like, for example, you have guns at home. That's a risk factor. Women tend to think about the downside of suicide. Okay, is this going to cause a lot of pain? What happened when I kill myself? What happened to my children? What happened to my cat? And things like that can go on. These are protective factors, right? Men tend to use more lethal means.
Suffocation? They suffocate themselves?
Oh, yes, through... Yeah, hang themselves or using some kind of, bags or whatnot to, suffocate themselves. All right. Again, just enlightening to all of us here is that there are lots and lots of intervention for depression these days. Every one of the patients come in to see me, I always encourage them and said, I'm so glad you're here. In order for you to walk in here, it shows a lot of courage. And I'm so thankful for you doing that. And in fact, I have a lot of hope for you because we can do the following, da-da-da-da-da. And if not all of them applicable to you, some of them will be helpful. Yes?
I have a question. How can you help somebody that don't want to look for help? They don't understand they have a problem. I had a boyfriend like that. He said, you see the signs, and he said you should look for a doctor or a psychologist. And he said, I'm not a crazy person. I don't need help.
Right.
And he killed himself.
Right.
And my mom had that depression, but she said, I don't need help. I can't figure it out on my own.
Right.
But you can see clearly that they do need help. So how can you help them if they don't want to help?
Right. Very good question. As you remember, I talked about before, 99% people walk in here, I'll get better. The one that don't get better is the one that do not return or do not engage in help, right? So the thing to do is to first demystify or destigmatize such that being depressed is not the same as being crazy. And in fact, if you normalize it, one of the most important things you can do is to normalize is that, we all get a little depressed sometimes, and we all get sick sometimes. When we get sick, we look for doctors, right? We don't, if you have, let's say, a lesion or whatnot, 5 minutes? Okay, great. We're going to be closing down pretty soon. But I think this is a very meaningful interaction. We want to speak to that. One is that you want to instill hope in these people that, look at people around us. We are dealing with stress and hazard in our life. We all can get depressed. We all can get sick. Well, it's okay. It's okay. And I'm going to sit with you when you're depressed. And I have been depressed before. And usually when you normalize it in such a way, they feel a sense of freedom. They feel destigmatized. And they feel like there's hope. So that would be the first step. The second thing that I tend to encourage people to do is that if you ever go visit people who are depressed, if you want to read some verses such as Psalm 23, it's okay, but just hopefully don't add any more commentary to it. Let them interpret for themselves, right? Sit with them, encourage them to do a little bit more bodily function. Turns out that bodily function is one of the best way to protect yourself from depression. I had a theory why men are less depressed than women is that men tend to be action-based. When you engage in physical actions, right, your body naturally generates natural antidepressant, not having to rely on artificial ingredients. We have studies shown that there's a direct correlation between the amount of exercise you do to the stability of serotonin and norepinephrine. So that's good news.